Well, hi, everybody. Thank you, those of you who are here in person and also those of you attending virtually for coming to the Carey Institute seminar today. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Daniel Zuleta. Daniel is a forest ecologist. His training was originally in forest engineering. He did his PhD at Universidad Nacional de Colombia in Medellin, studying forest dynamics and tree communities. During this time, he played a major role in developing the Amaquiacu forest dynamics plot, which is one of the only large forest plots in the northern Amazon. It's located right off the Amazon River in southern Colombia. Building on this work, he's actually now one of the co-PIs of this forest dynamics plot, helping coordinate forest research through the ForestGEO program. He now works with DOE's Next Generation Ecosystems Experiment in the Tropics and Smithsonian ForestGEO, where his primary role is coordinating the ForestGEO annual mortality monitoring program. So this is an effort to study pantropical tree mortality, develop a mechanistic understanding of what kills trees, and incorporate that into some of these next generation models. Really excited to have Daniel here today, and I will turn it over to him.
Great. Can you hear me well? Okay. Thanks, Evan. Thank you for such a great invitation and such a great introduction. It's very good. So hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Zuleta. I'm a postdoc at the Forest Global Earth Observatory of ForestGEO, working with the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiments Tropics. And yeah, I'll be talking about tree mortality and basically damage interactions and how it relates to the above ground biomass losses in tropical forests. But first of all, I would like to recognize that this is a large collaborative work in which there are many people involved. And this work wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration of people and institutions from the Forest Global Earth Observatory Network and the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment, some of which are listed here, but of course, there are many, many other people. So thank you. So yeah, today I'll be talking about tree mortality first and the implications and importance and challenges when studying tree mortality. Then I'll move on to how the causes of tree mortality are typically studied, specifically in the tropics. And then I'll present the ForestGEO annual mortality service and damage service, and with that specific three main goals or three main analyses or results we have obtained during the last couple of years. And just to conclude, some remarks and things to think. So why tree mortality? You all know, or as you may know, when a tree dies in a forest, it not only affects the community structure and population structure, but it also impacts the abiotic conditions by increasing light availability and changing soil properties at different spatial scales, depending on the size of the tree, right? But tree mortality is also considered as the main source of biomass losses in forest dynamics, because changes in tree mortality happen more rapidly compared to changes in tree growth and tree recruitment. I mean, in a single day, we may have a huge disturbance event that may kill hundreds of trees, but changes in growth and recruitment are much more slower than these changes, right? That's why because of that's what its importance in the forest dynamics or the carbon storage. Over the past few decades, several papers have reported an increase in tree mortality, but most of them have been related to drought and heat processes. We just discussed in this lab meeting 1 hour ago about one of these papers too. But for example, here, Henry Hartman and his colleagues from the International Tree Mortality Network just recently reported in this review some of the specific cases, such as very famous cases in Germany in 2019, or in California, we all know, in 2015, and even in Central Amazon in Brazil in 2016. But all these cases or these studies correspond to very specific cases. And for most of the forested areas in the world, we actually lacked data to attribute tree mortality to particular stressors. And data is even more scarce in the tropics. To date, the most comprehensive analysis on tree mortality trends has been performed by Roel Brennan et al. In 2015 and by Waynes Huao et al. In 2019. And they report that an increase in tree death in the Amazon, but they didn't detect a trend in Africa. So they attribute the carbon losses to these increases in tree mortality in the Amazon, but not this trend in Africa, right? But again, the causes of these trends are not well understood yet. So why? Why is it too difficult to attribute some causes of tree mortality? Here I will mention at least three main reasons that we have identified or have been discussed in the literature. The first one is that tree mortality is a rare event, right? Under normal conditions, only 1 to 3% of the trees die per year in tropical forests. And this number can go up to 4 to 5% if we include trees that are larger than 1 centimeter in diameter, right? So to be able to detect a change in such a small numbers, we will need large sample sizes, right? So many trees monitored over time, basically. The second problem is that there is a high variability in tree mortality, both spatially and both spatial and temporal scales, right? For example, here we see a figure from Jane Esquivel et al. In 2020, in which they report that mortality in the northern parts of the Amazon, maybe it varies from 1.3% a year to 2.2 in the west and 2.8 in the southern part of the Amazon. And you may be thinking, okay, these numbers are all very small, yes, but if you take a closer look, you can see that the mortality actually doubled from the northern part to the southern part, right? So, but even within a given site, mortality can vary over time. In a total independent study, we found in 2017 that tree mortality pre-drought tree mortality pre-drought was 1.4% that year, and post-drought was 3.3% that year, which is more than double for the 25 hectares of Macayaco Forest Dynamics plot, which is located right here in the northwestern Amazon. And in this case, we found that trees located on valleys got more affected or had a higher mortality rate compared to trees located on slopes and ridges, right? That has been discussed from some people working in the labs of Flavio da Costa and Rafael Oliveira have reported that this might be related to some functional traits or some ability to resist droughts for trees located on ridges compared to trees located on valleys, right? And we can discuss more on that at the end. So this altogether demonstrates that tree mortality is highly variable across both space and time, even within a single site, okay? Now, another issue, finally, one of the most important challenges we face when studying the causes of tree mortality is that trees may die due to multiple factors. There are many factors involved in the tree death, right? And I love this example that was reported over 30 years ago by Franklin, and it was based on the mortality spiral or disease spiral of Mannion in 1981 that shows the mortality spiral, or showing the factors that may affect the tree and lead to its death of a Douglas fir, right? So here we start with a healthy tree that is unable to withstand competition, and then is suppressed by larger trees and became defoliated. And because it is defoliated, it increases its probability to be attacked by bark beetles, and which carry the blood stain fungus and kills the tree because it blocks the transpiration stream of the tree. So the tree finally died, not only because of the action of the blue stain fungus, but because of the accumulated factors or circumstances that he faced over time during its life, right? So this spiral is for a well-known temperate species, but it can certainly vary, be totally different depending for other species, or it can vary depending for a tree of the same species located on a different spot of the forest, or subjected to different climatic conditions, right? So can you imagine, for example, how would be the spirals of the 653 species we may found in an Amazon terra firma forest, such as in Macayacu per hectare? So can we really identify common factors that result in tree death? That's the main challenge in this third point, right? So that's why one of the main gaps in tropical forest dynamics is in mortality is to understand what is the relative role that all these abiotic and biotic drivers play on tree mortality, right? Such as increasing temperature, or increasing vapor pressure deficit, or the role of lianas, or all these interrelated factors. What's their actual role on tree mortality, the relative role? In the tropics, tree mortality, or the causes of tree mortality, has been studied basically following these two main approaches. The first one is using a post hoc assessment of death, by inspecting dead trees, which is commonly used or known as the modes of death, in which trees that are broken and uprooted are attributed to mechanical factors such as winds, and trees that are found dead standing are attributed to physiological factors such as droughts or light competition, right? However, this approach makes strong assumptions on what happened before or after the death. We don't really know when the process or the mechanism, what was the time of the mechanism, right? And that would be the case, for example, for trunk breakage. You don't know if the trunk broke before or after the death, so you cannot attribute that to strong assumptions. Leaning, fungal infection, and turn rot. We also think this approach, in addition, some of potential causes of tree mortality might not be identified from these dead trees because, for example, defoliated, the tree is already defoliated. We do not know if the tree was defoliated right before dying or not, or how was the process of the defoliation, or herbivory, or even light limitation. Conditions in the forest may change in just one day, and we don't know if the tree was limited or not, right? And some evidence may disappear as wood decomposes, such as the role of lianas, stranglers, or if it had wounds or deformities. We were talking yesterday with Evan, and the wood decomposition rates may be highly variable in tropical forests. Some preliminary results from him in BCI and Macayacu. So we don't really know, and this wood decomposition rates may be very high, and we cannot assess things like this, like lianas. It has lianas, it has stranglers, or wounds or deformities, right? And this is even worse, or this effect is exacerbated in tropical forests when the long census, or when cases in which the long census intervals are long, such as it's common in tropical forests, right? We measure and remeasure the census, the plots every 5 to more years, right? So that's the main approach. And the second approach is based on specific or favorites or famous conditions on living trees, such as the example that I showed you from us about the droughts in the Amazon. So we attributed that increase in mortality to drought, but we do not really know if there was another cause. It was just a blowdown right before, or in the middle of the time census interval or the period. So this, the second approach, do not consider this multivariate nature of tree mortality that I just explained through the spirals, right? So to overcome all these problems, we will really need more frequent censuses, focus on multiple tree level conditions, inspecting many things on living trees, right? And across, of course, a diversity of tropical forests. So in 2016, Gabriel Arellano and Stuart Davis, the director of ForestGEO, initiated a program to try to overcome these limitations and get more specific data on the conditions of trees before dying, and initiated the ForestGEO Next Generation Ecosystem Experiments annual tree mortality surveys in these 8 sites, 4 in the NGEE-Tropics and 4 in Asia. And to date, we have performed 30 surveys or 30 censuses on making approximately 190,000 stamper times of observations on 60,000 trees and approximately 2,000 species across the tropics. The main aim of this census or this protocol is to evaluate tree vigor, biomass losses, and factors that are likely to be associated with future tree death on living trees, right? And there's factors such as insects, the presence of lianas, or the degree of liana infestation, and the presence of stranglers, disturbance, of course, damage, and many others that I will discuss later. But doing this in a standardized way so that we can quickly do it in more frequent, more frequently, right? So we also collected data on the physical state of the well-known so-called modes of death, such as I just mentioned, in order to see to what extent the previous conditions on living trees actually match these modes of death. I'm gonna show the results next. And data to estimate damage, which is an important part of this story. So specifically to estimate damage, we collected the living length and the remaining crown within the living length, which is basically the proportion of newly broken branches on the living length. So by damage here, I refer to those caused by branch fall or trunk breakage, or even the decay, the slow decay in standing trees, right? To do so, I used these 2 field-based variables and matched it with cumulative volume profile models that describe the volume accumulated along the tree height in both the trunk and crown. And I matched it basically, or these models were obtained from 177 trees scanned with terrestrial laser. And what I present here is the relative volume of the tree along tree height. So for the gray line, which is also here, I present how the volume accumulates on as we increase in tree height, right, in the trunk, and the black line is the total volume of both the trunk and the crown or the branches. So I matched this living length and the newly proportion of broken branches with this model to obtain the actual volume of the tree in a given time, right? So for example, see, if a tree was broken at half of its height, it will have lost more than 20% of the total volume, right? In both the trunks and branches. Then I use this time or this estimates time by time or census by census, and just run it through the different censuses we have, and which varies from site to site. Some sites have 6 mortality surveys, and some others just 2 right now. So yeah, with this, the main goals or the main 3 goals we had is, or I have right now, is was to identify mortality risk factors and characterize their relative importance of different mortality risk factors based on these broad conditions that we collected. To evaluate, second was to evaluate to what extent does our or do the previous conditions on living trees and the risk that trees have before dying actually match those predictions or those inferences that are usually done from the modes of death, right? And then finally, to estimate and compare the above ground biomass losses from dead trees versus above ground biomass losses from damaged but living trees. And that's what I call the overlooked biomass losses, right? In tropical forests right now. So very briefly, we collected this set of conditions in the first columns of each of these tables. I don't want to spend much on this, but with each of these conditions, we modeled the probability of dying the next year, right? So the conditions were measured right in time zero, but then we assessed whether the tree died or not in the next year. And with that, we estimated the probability or modeled the probability of dying, recognizing species differences using species random slopes and intercepts, but independently for each condition, because we didn't have enough sample size to perform a multivariate model on all these conditions. And yeah, we can talk more about it. And with that, I defined as at risk those living trees, of course, that have more than twofold probabilities of death, depending on each condition, right? Okay, we can go back to this table at the end if we want. So we explored 19 mortality risk factors in total and found that light limitation and those risks related to tree damage, highlighted here in red, were the most impactful in the forests. So I'm sorry, before that, for each risk factor, we defined its prevalence in the forest or how frequent they were, its lethality as a measure of what's the mortality of trees without that risk factor versus the mortality of trees with the risk factor, and its impact, which was defined as the contribution to stand level mortality of each risk factor, right? So in this case, light limitation and those risks related to damage were the most impactful risk factor. Then being smaller, limbed, and defoliated ranked next in importance. And those risk factors that are expected to be important, such as lianas or wounds or deformities or stranglers, even stranglers, didn't play a bigger role in these data sets. But that's, of course, because in these ForestGEO plots, we consider all trees from 1 centimeter and above, right? So an obvious question might be, okay, the role of light limitation might be lower for trees larger than that DBH threshold, right? So the point is that I repeated all these analyses for trees larger than 10 centimeters in DBH or diameter, and the ranking of importance of mortality risk factors was qualitatively similar, right? Being a crown damage, of course, the one and those related to damage, the most important. So on one hand, we have that damage is an important precondition related to future tree death, okay? Regarding the modes of death, we found very limited evidence. Oh, these colors are very different here, okay? Very limited difference, very limited inferences from the modes of death. I'm gonna explain this chart. It's a core diagram in which in the lower part, we have all the risk factors and even trees without the risk factors. For 2,100 dead trees we found over this study in these 6 tropical forests. And on the upper part, we have the link on how did they die the next year, okay? In each of these modes of death, including, of course, the unidentified modes of death, because we have plenty of small trees that just got missing the next year. So as you can see, for example, let's take light limitation risk factor. And we might have expected that trees that were light limited may have died dead standing according to the common inference made from the modes of death. But in fact, or in reality, the proportion of dead standing of light limitation or trees with the light limitation risk that died standing was very similar to the proportion of trees with the light limitation risk that died broken, right? And it makes sense because some of these were very small trees that just get impacted by falling branches or neighboring trees, right? So we can't, the message being that it is inference created, these were all annual censuses. Inferences from these modes of death, even at the 1 year time scale, are very limited to infer the physiological or to put it into the physiological versus mechanical factors, right? And talks about the multivariate nature of tree mortality. So as the third objective, we have this overlooked loss, forest biomass losses. And as you may know, in forest dynamics, the net change in forest above ground biomass, or AGB, is commonly estimated as new additions in carbon from growth, from the tree growth, plus the biomass of newly recruited trees, minus the biomass of trees that died, and that's it. In general, this is the net change in forest above ground biomass, right? But as you can see in these figures, damage is a very prevalent condition in forests, right? You can see it here right now. And for example, in this figure in the middle, we have a tree in BCI with the painting for the diameter measurement. So if you do not record, you only go and measure the diameter and estimate the biomass from its diameter, which is intact, right? You will estimate a given biomass for this diameter that is maybe for a bigger tree, but you do not record or don't look up and record the height at which the tree was broken, right? And that will influence, of course, these estimates of what's the actual amount of biomass that is lost year after year, right? So our objective was to compare above ground biomass losses from dead trees versus the damaged but living trees. And we found that total above ground biomass losses were 8.72 megagrams per hectare per year in our current estimates. But interestingly, we found that biomass from living trees corresponded to 42% of this total estimate. So it is almost half of the total biomass losses. Okay. And as it might be expected, these rates were highly variable across sites and over time. Briefly, very briefly, here I present panel by panel each site, and the same structure for the pie diagram. So in which the gray is the proportion of biomass losses from damaged by living trees, and black is from dead trees. And here is the temporal trend, but I'm not going to discuss this. But being the most different sites, Fushan, a typhoon-prone forest in Taiwan, and Paso, which is here, which is a dipterocarp forest in Malaysia. We can discuss more on all these changes. And how does our numbers compare to other studies? So using different approaches to estimate branchfall and this kind of stuff, some studies have reported that this can be that the role of branchfall on total biomass losses might be up to 47, or based on airborne radar in Peru, in Colombia by Mervin and Esner, and 28 using airborne radar 2 in the Brazilian Amazon, 30% for the 4C database, which is a database on carbon stocks and fluxes, recently developed by Anderson Teixeira et al. In 2018. And it can be, it was estimated as 23% in Panama using drone flights by Raquel Araújo and et al. In 2021, and even 17% from woody debris, which is kind of the only study that has comprehensively studied these changes or contribution of branchfall to total biomass losses. I know this might be surprising, or our result might be surprising, that almost half of the biomass losses are from damaged by living trees. But let me explain what it means here. And so let's say we have 100 living and undamaged trees, or we start our sample with this example, with this sample, sorry. These 100 living and damaged trees are represented by these open circles here. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, one well-known feature of tropical forests is that tree mortality is rare. So let's say we found after 1 year when we visited the forest, just 2% of these trees that died. So we will have just these 2 dead trees represented by the closed circles, black circles on the right. So these 2 dead trees, the biomass of these 2 dead trees will correspond to this portion of our pie diagram. But after 1 year, we will also find many damaged trees, right? And it's much more prevalent than dead, which are represented here, sorry, here by the partially filled circles, right? The biomass that is lost from these trees, and will correspond to this gray portion of the pie diagram, right? So at the end, what this result means is that the above ground biomass that is lost from the few trees that die is almost equivalent to the above ground biomass from many trees that get damaged but remain alive. Census over census, right? Or over time. But remember, this changes, this is highly variable across sites, so we need to keep that in mind too. So I'd say, and some of you will be wondering, okay, what's the point of all this if at the end damaged trees will die, as I just presented in the first objective, right? Well, yeah, damaged trees were the most impactful risk factor because of its high prevalence and moderate lethality. And by moderate lethality, I mean that not all damaged trees die. And here I present the probability of death as a function of the relative previous damage, the year before, for each of the sites. And as you can see, it's weird, the colors are, okay. But as you can see, in this section, we may have trees that can lose up to 40% of their previous damage, but without a significant increase in their probability of dying, right? Of course, and again, as a consequence, this may vary a lot across sites, being the most different sites again, Paso and Fushan, okay? So in Fushan, we can have trees that can get highly damaged and do not die, maybe, or lose up to 60% of their previous damage, right? So it is important. The question now is, so my point here is that so in this region, we may find trees that, or AGB losses that are not captured by long-term studies that are focused only on tree mortality and do not account for damage losses, right? Now, these results are all from 1 year census intervals. So the question is, what if we give the trees or the damaged trees more time to die, right? Would they, and the expectation is that actually the role of damaged trees on total above ground biomass losses will decrease with the time census interval, right? Because it's not the same to just wait 1 year and assess or compare biomass from dead trees versus biomass losses from living trees just 1 year after than 5 years after, right? So, and in fact, here I found that it tends to decrease, but not too drastically, right? So here I showed that the above ground biomass losses in total at the 1 year time, the 1 year time scale versus 5 year, 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 year time scale. biomass losses from dead trees too, and biomass losses from living but damaged trees, right? So it tends to decrease, but it's not like a sharp decrease in biomass. So this is still important, even at the 5 years scale. We can find around almost 2 megagrams per hectare per year that are lost from damaged but living trees. Okay. Yeah, that's the main message with this. And of course, missed one slide. Okay. So as a conclusion, here we show that the first ranking of importance of these conditions, or how condition of these mortality risk factors in tropical forests, being damaged, one of the most important, and light limitation, one of the most important mortality risk factors. Future research, we think it should be focused on resolving the actual causal links, because these are those symptomatic factors. We just inspect the trees, but then the future research should really focus on resolving these causal links between the drivers, the actual drivers, such as increasing vapor pressure deficit, increasing temperature, or increasing frequencies of drought, etc. These risk factors and the physiological consequences to be able to actually match this in vegetation models. Okay. I also showed that the role of damage as a key factor in tropical forest dynamics, because it was not only the most impactful risk factor, but also accounted for significant AGV losses in surviving trees, in trees that do not necessarily die, even after the 5-year time scale. Okay. And regarding this damage, and that's why that was why I entitled the talk as damaged tree mortality interactions. I think more research should be done on the physiological consequences of this tree damage to actually understand the mechanism behind the tree death because of damage, right? And so we went down to Amakayaku last year and collected non-structural carbohydrates. This is a preliminary, very preliminary result. Collected non-structural carbohydrates on 60 trees that were, along a gradient of relative previous damage. And the main expectation is that non-structural carbohydrates will decrease, and that will lead to the next death, or the death in the next year, right? But what we found is that some of these, not all, non-structural carbohydrates such as starch, did decrease or do decrease with damage, but it only happens for trees that belong to species with lower wood density. And it's almost constant for trees with higher wood density, which might presumably have other mechanisms to deal with damage, right? Or explains their resistance to damage, right? Yeah, that would be it. And finally, I would just want to thank all this great, amazing group of field assistants. We have the ForestGEO network, which have worked, we're able to even continue collecting some of these data sets even during the pandemic. And yeah, thank you all for your yeah. I think I always run a lot.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for the great talk. We have some time for questions. I think we can start in here with some questions. I guess I can start us off. I was interested, related to these damage patterns you've shown, what would be the implications of the damage that we see and how that might feed into some of these ecosystem models that I know related to some of the NGEE-Tropics work?
Yeah, great. Thanks for raising that question. So what I think here is that, or something that actually Jesse Needham from Berkeley is working on, and we have a paper in review right now, is that she has been working on the model of tree damage in fates, which is one of the vegetation models. But basically, we can get the physiological consequences of tree damage, let's say that if the non-structural carbohydrates or the starch content decreased by a given number, we can plug that number into the model directly and say, okay, this is the threshold for this kind of species. And if the species decreases or has this given damage, let's say 80% of the previous biomass was lost, then it will be this will be the non-structural carbohydrate value, and therefore will die or survive depending on, for example, the wood density and the plant functional types that we were discussing before. Yeah. So that would be the main way to include it in vegetation models. Yeah.
Okay,
of course, we will have to deal with this trade-off between computational effort, if it really matters to include this whole new model or module in this kind of models, versus just the patterns as are right now. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Winslow, did you want to go?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for a great talk.
Thank you.
The relationship between relative damage and probability of mortality or mortality risk is really interesting. How like that made me wonder if you could start to actually map damage from drones or remote sensing. Do you think you could start to make maps predicting where mortality might happen in the next few years?
Yeah, and for those of you online, Winslow asked, he referenced that interesting pattern related to the probability of mortality as a function of damage, and was wondering if there are future opportunities to map mortality risk using remote sensing.
That's a great question. Thanks for that. Well, actually, with Helena Muller-Landau in BCI, we have and Raquel Araújo and Casey Kuzman, they have this monthly maps of recent disturbance, canopy disturbance, and we are working, hope to work soon, on how it relates to our ground-based estimates of damage. So, and there are some great papers that have been published recently from, for example, Ricardo Dallagnol in the Amazon, showing LiDAR scanning, how it matches with tree mortality. But of course, we have many limitations with this. It must match at some extent, right? Depending on the spatial scale and temporal scale too. But we may have some cases such as, or some of my preliminary results in BCI show that there might be some crown damage that happens, is detected by the drone, but below we may have another values or another branches broken that are not detected by this remote sensing. So yeah, I think we should do a better job in trying to capture all this or match these measurements. But yes, we are moving forward towards that. Yeah.
And Jane, you had your hand up.
I was wondering if there is consistent, and I know you probably need to sample size, but consistent species level response. Like, are some species more likely to be damaged while others are more likely to?
Yeah, definitely. In general, species with lower wood density are more prone to get damaged, to break. So we use in these models, which were used to define the risks, at least for the damage condition, we had a species random interception slope. So, and we can actually see how the huge variability in the responses to damage, species by species. And it's always a never-ending problem because we have a lot of species or a lot of responses. So how to actually collapse these responses is very difficult, but wood density is a good predictor for that. Yeah. Great question. Thanks.
And Shannon, I think you.
So we know that ecosystem function, of course, as you started with, is really dependent on these canopy gaps, creating some frequency. Where does the 1 to 2% tree mortality, doubling to 2%, fit within the resilient forest ecosystem?
And for those of you online, Shannon asked, in the context of forest dynamics gap creation and sort of those structural changes, how does the changes in mortality that Danielle talked about, these increases potentially from 1 or 2% to 3 or 4%, how does that influence the forest in general and its resilience? Is that about right?
Yeah, or is it known what the threshold is, at which point mortality rates are too high for the forest to function as it does?
Well, a quick answer for that would be it would be too higher when it exceeds the recruitment rate, right? So that the forest is not stable anymore. But that should be done in terms of not only of individual stem basis, but also in the biomass basis. So that would be and it's totally dependent on the biome or the even location and topography of the forest. So yeah, but a quick answer to that would be when the tree mortality is higher than the tree recruitment, there we are in a state.
Higher ranges of 3 to 4% starting to approach that.
Yeah. Not necessarily. I think it depends a lot also on which are the trees that are dying, right? Because there's some research that also suggests that there are compositional changes, so that as the Amazon, for example, face more frequent and intense droughts, it tends to select more species that are more able to withstand drought, right? That's with that prioritize hydraulic safety over water transport, for example. And so there's some research about how it has changed through time given those conditions, but I don't know if that answered your questions directly. Is that right?
And Peter, do you have a question?
I guess I was have questions about trend response. So are you going to develop a methodology to see if mortality is going up in different types of forests? And kind of related to that, well, that's a different question, but I'm also interested in, are these second growth forests or these primary forests? Second growth forests much less susceptible to this than the primary?
Yeah, so Peter sort of had two questions. I guess maybe we'll start with the second one. It was, are these primary forests, are these secondary forests, and are there differences in the susceptibility of those forests to these different drivers?
So yeah, that's a great question. I should have said that these are presumably intact forests, right? And besides of Fushan, who is subjected to it's a typhoon-prone forest that is almost impacted for a typhoon, one typhoon every year. They're all under relatively non-big, huge disturbances. So there are presumably intact forests or without anthropogenic disturbance. And the second question was about if we are thinking about an approach to actually assess tree mortality over time, right? So we are working on that right now. And of course, one of the main issues is data availability, because even though we have these ForestGEO plots spread across the around 25, 22 forests in the tropics, it's not enough to actually assess tree mortality trends over time, and even more to attribute a specific driver to this trend. So that is very limited, and we are working on bringing together some other networks to actually perform a pantropical analysis on mortality.
Seems like a critically important question.
Yes, it is. Yes. I'm so excited for that too.
Yeah, some of the hardest data to get. Michelle.
Awesome talk. Super cool to see that so much, I guess, biomass is lost from damage. I don't know if there's syntheses between like crosstalk between people who work at like plot inventory versus like flux towers, but just some of that, like, I don't know, is there a crosstalk between the two, and then would some of that carbon loss from damage reconcile with the consistency and the flux data?
That's
Yeah. So the question was first, how much interaction is there between this type of forest inventory work and flux tower work, looking at overall gas exchange? and how some of the damage patterns to not mortality, but damage to living trees might affect these fluxes that we measured at the flux towers.
As far as I know, there is interaction. It's very limited actually, but there are some networks that work with flux towers at the same time while they measure their tree mortality, growth, and recruitment, but that's it. They don't measure, for example, they have some woody debris too, right? But it may be the way to calculate it, but we are missing a huge component, and not saying for the damage, but a huge component of the actual rates or respiration rates and carbon fluxes, that is decomposition. We don't really know what happens after the trunk fell into the ground, on the ground, right? So we are still missing that, and there are mismatches in the values of fluxes and versus forest-based or forest inventory-based estimates of carbon fluxes. There are mismatches, and maybe we can help to resolve that with this damage. But it's just above ground. In the meantime, we do not know anything about wood decomposition and below ground, so it's a lot of work to do actually.
And I had a question. You had the interesting patterns looking at the univariate risk factors and their association with mortality. And 3 of those seem to be damage, trunk damage, crown damage. Have you examined at all what risk factors predict future trunk and crown damage, sort of taking a structural equation modeling approach?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
I haven't yet, but yeah, open to that kind of analysis too. Just wood density in a very broad way, as I explained to Jane, and from the species random intercepts and slope, or the random effects of these models, just to quickly see whether there was an overall trend and how can we kind of group them. But no, of course, it's a lot more to do. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of interactions.
Great.
Well, great. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I think that's all our questions here. And can we give Danielle another round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, we'll see you all here and those of you virtually for the seminar next week.